So, one of the pieces that you read for this week, What Sexual Liberation Really Looks Like by the British author Louise Perry, um, is an excerpt from a book that she published in February of 2025. And that book is actually a recasting or a retooling of a book that she published back in 2022 called The Case Against the Sexual Revolution. And this latest book is a less academically oriented work than The Case Against the Sexual Revolution. And in particular, with this latest book, she's really trying to target younger women. When the Case for the Sexual Revolution hit the scene back in 2022, it struck like a cultural bomb went off, and got all kinds of attention because Perry's arguing very aggressively that the kind of sexual ethic that Goldman advocates for is catastrophically destructive, particularly for women. And in other words, the approaching sex as if it's simply a tool that we use, like a utilitarian tool that we use to satisfy this desire or impulse that we have for physical contact with another person's body, is a really profoundly unhealthy way to think about sex and sexuality, and it results in people paying a pretty hefty price. We'll talk about Perry's argument about hookup culture and whether or not her claims about how damaging it is, particularly to young women, are actually accurate on the discussion board. But here what I want to focus on is a fact or a phenomenon that happened as a result of Perry's book back in 2022. And that is that there was a whole bunch of other women that came forward and kind of with this collective sigh of relief said, oh my gosh, Perry is telling my story. This is the environment that I have lived in as a millennial, as a Gen Xer, growing up. I've grown up in a world that embraces the sexual ethic described by Goldman, and it's made me miserable, these people claim. And one of the people that got a lot of attention herself for simply responding to Louise Perry's book was the podcaster British Phetasy. She's a comedian podcaster. Podcast is called The Dumpster Fire. And it got a lot of attention because she was well known, or is well known, but it also got a lot of attention because people were saying that what she was describing were experiences that they had had themselves. So you read this piece by British Phetasy called I Regret Being a Slut. And in it she says, I'm a case study for her thesis, in other words, Louise Perry's thesis, a cautionary tale. I knew this book was going to be difficult for her to read, and it made me realize it's time to finish this essay, one I've been trying to write for 4 years. And in this piece, what Phetasy says is this, is the rest of my sexual encounters, that is, those encounters that did not take place within the context of a loving, committed relationship, I would put in the category of casual, or what Goldman might call plain sex, which I would define as sex that is either meaningless or mediocre or both. If I get really honest with myself, I'd say most of these usually drunken encounters left me feeling empty and demoralized and worthless. Okay, now let's think about the couple things here that are really noteworthy. How can sex be meaningful? And should it be? Remember, what Goldman is saying is, well, the meaning that we might derive from sex is the meaning of having this desire satisfied. And beyond that, any meaning that we find in a sexual encounter is meaning that we're bringing into it and imposing on it. It's not actually intrinsically there. But Phetasy seems to be saying, well, gosh, when I have these sexual encounters and it takes place outside the context of particular emotional attachments with another person, the sex doesn't seem to have meaning. Well, how can sex have meaning, and what should that meaning be? And how does that relate to this really profound claim that she makes at the end of her essay here, that these meaningless encounters left her feeling empty and demoralized, and most importantly, worthless, right? Because that's now talking about value. Why is it that meaningless sex would leave one feeling empty, demoralized, and without value or worthless? Because what Goldman is saying is, we have something of value, the ability to have sex that allows us to satisfy this urge that we have. And that's the value of sex. It satisfies that urge. But what Phetasy seems to be saying is that there's something more here. And that when that more in sex is diminished or ignored or compromised, it leaves her feeling like she's without value. She's worthless. She's demoralized. And think about how we might describe meaningless other encounters, the physical encounters that we have with other people. There's sometimes when we shake a person's hand And it's just pro forma. It's totally meaningless. There's nothing there. Do you walk away from that experience feeling empty, demoralized, and worthless? What if you go out on the dance floor with someone, right? And your bodies are touching one another and you're dancing and you're just not having a good time? Do you go home and say, oh my God, I'm so demoralized. I feel so worthless after that lousy dancing that I experienced? And I'm going to bet the answer is no. So maybe think to yourself, what other physical encounters could a person have that involve another person in their body that would lead them feeling worthless, leave them feeling empty, leave them feeling demoralized? And if we come to the conclusion that, there seems to be something unique about sexual experiences that we have that can generate this depth of negative emotion, then we want to figure out, well, what exactly is intrinsic to sex that makes it capable of plunging us into such depths of despair that Fedesi describes? And does that intrinsic value that we locate in sex point to any kind of unique sexual ethic?